Hege, I was just wondering when I was listening to you, because this gigafactory is actually five facilities in Mo i Rana that you are setting up.
Sorry, say again.
Are they 5 facilities actually that you're...
So we are building 5 factories, 1 pilot factory which we're already building inside a former oil and gas building. We threw everything out and we're taking that over as a pilot factory. And then we're building 4 gigafactories in Mo i Rana, yes.
And you have a need for, is it like 2 gigawatts of electric power?
So we have chosen a technology which is an MIT spin-off, which actually reduces the need of power with 50% compared to what our Chinese and Northvolt competitors are using. But yes, we are going to need a lot of power up there.
And with the energy prices that we see now, how do you calculate for that?
So, to be honest, in northern Norway, they are not able to sell their energy that far. So the prices haven't changed too much up there, so we are not very concerned about that for now. But clearly this is, and I heard our green steel, the green steel producers also, looking for much more renewable energy, and obviously a lot of industries are, I think, attracted to this region because of the renewable, affordable energy, so that's not going to last. That's clear.
Thank you for that clarification. I'm trying to look at Joanna, because when you were giving your presentation, Joanna, you did show us a lot of initiatives that were interesting to listen to, but large numbers and so on. And circularity is part of the transitional phase that you're in at the moment. When you're listening to Hege and the plans for this gigafactory, what do you think? Is that a vital part of how Europe should work towards its transition?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the question. I think the question is indeed how to store energy in the increasingly electrified system. And therefore the question of batteries, both at the low scale and bigger scale use, is of fundamental importance. So we do work already internally in the Commission on a specific battery strategy and alliance to different industries to better understand the needs. But we also do work internationally with different countries to understand how they advance the battery framework. I think one element of the presentation of my predecessor that has really come before is the dependence on raw materials. This has been a challenge, and it's going to be an increasing challenge in the months and years to come, especially for the renewable sector, and therefore close cooperation will be indeed necessary between those countries that are able to source raw materials. Of course, with that, there comes a challenge of creating new dependencies. So as we exit from fossil fuels, there is a risk we will fall into new patterns of dependence. But that also is something that needs to be carefully looked at, because there is an overall shortage of raw materials in the world, as you know.
And I've also been thinking, when we're talking about regional strategies, we have Suzana representing Latin America, Valerie was talking about China and the US, Joanna, the EU, and we have 2 companies here as well that are, well, one of them is a global company, and I suppose FREYR is aiming at becoming a large company. It's all interdependent in many ways, because you have raw materials that are not necessarily close to where your factory is. And I think you, Suzana, said something about we need to be independent. But at the same time, it's impossible, isn't it?
Yeah, completely independent, of course, we cannot be, but especially in the so globalized world. But the most we can, it will be better, especially on essential things. Well, now we are seeing the issue of energy, which is essential for economics. But I remember when the pandemic, COVID, the issue of vaccines and the insumes, the raw material to produce, well, even the masks. Again, what is the big deal producing masks? We import masks from China. because we didn't have. So I think we need to be at most independent as possible.
But then corporations, they have to comply with local regulations, as Valerie was also explaining about. How is that for Shell, for instance, being a global company, having to adjust sort of to different types of region and different types of expectations and regulations?
You have to comply with the local, but you also have to hold your standard up to the global. If you go somewhere and there are local standards that are lower than what you take as your corporate view, you can't do that. But I think, we've done that for a long time in the oil and gas industry, and I don't think it'll be any different when we move into the new things. But I would just like to come back to the interconnectivity of the world. I mean, the reality is energy is quite expensive to move around. Crude oil's cheap, coal's a bit more expensive, LNG is very expensive. Electricity, in the form of hydrogen or whatever else, it's very expensive to move around. So you tend to go to where the opportunity is. So that's why you're going to northern Norway.
Valerie, you were talking about China and how there is a great potential in shared cost burden. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Because China is a huge country. You were explaining how it's big in renewables, but it's big in other areas as well.
Sure, yeah. I think, so on renewables, what I meant was specifically that today renewables are dropping in cost, but are still more expensive than alternatives for use at scale. And so the issue then is, how do you support the purchasing of renewables when they are more expensive, either for regulatory reasons or for market reasons? And so I think there are different ways to get around that, but one way of doing that is really, I think, signaling the potential demand. In the Norwegian context, because has really outlined the potential that signaling that your market is a hub for renewable energy resources, a place where you can get inexpensive green power, that is becoming a competitive advantage globally. And if you're speaking with one voice as a supplier or a corporate operating in China, saying we are prepared to dramatically expand our renewable energy purchasing and we just need clarity on how to do it, that's one way of sharing the load and saying, no pun intended, and thinking about how do you signal to the grid companies, the Chinese government, that those who are operating in China are prepared and need to move ahead and expand renewable energy purchasing. Thank you.
Okay, Hege, first.
I just wanted to add that, so our learning is that we are in conversations with Chinese companies and with Korean companies, Taiwan companies, to establish business in Norway or in the Nordics, co-investing with us because they feel the need to have a partner in doing this. But it's really because the EU are making requirements to the products that will be sold in the EU, to batteries, that are such that Chinese and Taiwanese will not be able to meet those requirements. So they want to establish themselves within, and hence are interested. They will keep producing in China and Taiwan and Korea as well, but they will establish themselves with us in the Nordics. And so this, so that's, the EU is really helping us make that happen. And it will be interesting to see how that will change the companies that are then establishing themselves with us, within their own companies back in China.
I think this is extremely helpful in terms of a trend in global competition, that companies are really looking for the places where they can access renewables at a reasonable price.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, I can see you're nodding. Did you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking indeed that we will not be able to fully remove the regulatory divergences that will appear also in those new markets and new segments such as hydrogen or biogases. But indeed, we have taken on ourselves the task to lead those efforts globally. And part of our outreach is indeed to influence the regulatory thinking in the different countries around the globe, if not to align, at least to try to exchange on how we can best ensure such convergence, because with the global trade rules in place, we should not forget them at the back of our heads. We need to ensure that we remain nonetheless open to trade. So that will be a bit of a delicate balance to walk, to develop rules that on the one hand drive up the performance of the industry and bring us closer to net zero, and at the same time remain compatible when it comes to international regulatory framework. So inevitably there will be tensions, but there will be also opportunities. And we saw that in other countries of the world, the EU technology has gone there and has impacted internal value chains and the way of regulating the sectors. So I think this is a welcome development.
Interesting. There's also a question regarding the local communities, and it's aimed at Valerie, but you can see if there are others who would like to respond as well. How can we ensure that local communities also get benefits from the energy transition projects that are located in their communities? Would you like to start, Valerie?
This is a really important question. We've been looking at this in the context of Pittsburgh, where I'm currently located, and the surrounding Appalachian context, as well as in China and in connection with other international collaborations. I think the key here is to really think about how the decision makers at the regional level can come together around goals for not just decarbonizing at least costs, but including other dimensions, other criteria in their decision-making process. And this might seem very basic, but it is in some ways very novel from the way that these policies are evaluated, these investment possibilities are evaluated. And so I would emphasize the need to consider, alongside the cost of decarbonization options, the local job creation potential, the way that the new jobs are distributed across different populations, different socioeconomic groups within that region. You need to think about public revenue generation, how the transition away from fossil energy assets may create gaps in public budgets and how those can be filled. And then you also want to think about connections with existing resources and capabilities in that region. Do you have inexpensive sources of local resources? In New Mexico, where we've done a case study, we see huge potential, for example, for solar and wind, which is already partially being realized, but could be expanded dramatically. And so I think as you look at these different investments at the regional level, the coalition of players really needs to be thinking in a multidimensional way about the impacts of these investments.
Anyone else wanted to add something? Joanna, I can see that you're nodding. You can just point your fingers when you want to.
Yes, thank you. So just two short comments from me. In the latest regulatory framework we developed on electricity, we have specific provisions in the EU, and we hope for them to be also available in Norway and in the EA countries soon, is to promote the so-called development of energy communities, which are local communities of users of electricity who become collectively producers. Those schemes are being developed at various speed across various regions in the EU already, partly on a voluntary basis, but now this is regulated at EU level. And the purpose of that is exactly to get a better buy-in of the individuals to renewable energy projects. You are all familiar, I guess, with the phenomenon of not in my backyard type of reaction to installation of onshore renewable energy. Partly the response to that has been to develop more capacity offshore for that reason. But this is one of the ways in which we can ensure that ordinary citizens do benefit also directly from the clean energy transition. The other element, extremely briefly, is what the first speaker mentioned was the just transition. I didn't speak about that in my presentation, but we devote increasing attention in the EU to those communities that are inevitably going to suffer from the gradually closing fossil fuel producer communities, and in particular with reference to coal. Coal is still being produced in a number of regions in the EU, so you know what kind of challenge is ahead of those progressively as the specific member states decide to close up those facilities. There is a huge potential and also increasing attention to help those communities design exit strategies, and possibly, although of course this is not a one-to-one comparison, but get those people to work perhaps also for the clean industry instead.
Great, thank you. I am going to turn to the front row now, and because I see there are a couple of name tags being tilted. And Gunnar Eskeland, I know that you wanted to ask a question in the former session, so now you're going to get your chance. So Gunnar is professor at the Norwegian School of Economics, so I'm excited to hear your comment or question to the panel.
Well, I'd like to pull back a few steps and make everybody notice that today we have been presented for several impossible projects. Okay. You know, we're going to have carbon-free steel, we're going to have carbon-free aluminum, and we're going to have, we're going to have a lot of things a few steps ahead, which not many years ago were absolutely impossible. So if we think about the transition in that way, that we shall also make sure that things we think are impossible will be provided. That means that we shall, in a way, also make ourselves humble, admit that we don't know what is possible and what is not possible, to make sure that we are really challenging everybody to do what seems meaningless or impossible. Defy gravity, okay? That, and then, you know, with that step back, I'd like to ask the panel to reflect on, okay, if these things that we see now that we can do are to be viable, then in thinking that thought, what role do the following general policy instruments play? Europe's emission trading system, you know, quotas that are tradable within this area. And then things like feed-in tariffs, which are more specific that we have had, but which we can see, in my view, in other industries than electricity generation. And then, as Europe is, in my view, very impressively deciding to take the lead in the world's attempt to reduce emissions, we are hearing that we may get carbon border adjustment mechanism, which kind of makes it, in my view, possible for Europe to push its own energy-intensive tradables harder without simply being outcompeted. And when we're thinking about that mechanism, we're also starting to think about how is it going to be that as we push our own industries and activities, we do it in a way which can also tempt others to adopt and compete within Europe, for instance. So in other words, when we're thinking about these fantastic, magical transformations of specific industries, what role does the more general policy environment play in making it feasible?
That's a big question. Hege, you would like to go
first? I just want to share one first reflection on that question, which is that it is admirable that Europe has taken on these these policies, because they are costly in a way, and it has been costly, I think. And I think the Hydro representative was alluding to how then they have tried to also manage the competitiveness of European industry by compensating with free quotas, etc. But I think the point is that it has enabled scaling of technologies that then suddenly take over, and the technologies themselves become good enough and commercially available and competitive. So you get to a point where Europe now can harvest back from that investment, if you like, through technologies that are now available, commercially competitive, and you can start scaling and on a competitive basis. And I think that doesn't apply to CCS yet, and it doesn't apply to hydrogen yet, but it does apply to batteries and to solar and to wind onshore, etc. And I think so there's an initial investment that will pay back because the technology itself becomes, advanced enough.
Do you think these schemes should be continued?
It's very smart.
Others in the panel who would like to comment on that? Suzana or Joanna?
Just a brief reaction. Indeed, as my predecessor just said, I think we entered a certain snowball effect of the policy that we have experienced, in particular on the rollout of renewable electricity and wind power in particular, I have in my mind. We started with the feed-in tariffs. We no longer need them because we replaced them by auctions, and now the cost of every extra marginal kilowatt of electricity generated by wind power is essentially zero. So we do expect that the same snowball effect is going to happen in the other industries. And I think our role as far as the EU level is concerned is to anticipate those trends and dare to be bold, such that industry and also member states, governments and authorities at local level can actually also get encouragement to implement those policies in practice. Because there is still a lot of bottlenecks at a low level when it comes to permitting, when it comes to acceptance by individuals, as I mentioned before, access to raw materials, and these are all elements that are actually for member states, also individually governments to tackle in addition to the European level. So we should dare to be bold.
Paul Rasmussen, Gasco, you would like to ask a question or comment to the panel.
Maybe not so broad as the last question. I'm going directly to Europe. And Joanna, thank you for joining us, Joanna. You're working in very challenging times in the DG Energy. Just after lunch, Putin have threatened to close down export of gas to Europe. So things are happening quite rapidly. On top of that, you have been revising all regulations and directives to align them with the ambition of the Fit for 55 package. So you're doing impressive work. In light of what's happening now and also the ambition to close down imports from Russia, could you elaborate a little bit around the Arctic policy of the EU? Will there be a revision of that? Is there anything coming on that side, because that will have quite some effects, at least for Norway, and the possibility to continue delivering at high rates to Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, what I tried to pass as a message in my presentation is that while we try to tackle the short-term challenges related specifically to the Russia's invasion in Ukraine, we are absolutely not losing sight of the bigger picture and of our objective to achieve net zero by 2050. So in fact, if you will, there are two tracks of work happening in parallel. And in that regard, the Arctic policy is, of course, a product of the times before the war started. We are currently reflecting on it. At the same time, I would like to note that what it meant to cover is essentially new investments that would come on stream as of 2040, 2045. So that is not a strategy that is meant to tackle or address the immediate ongoing efforts to produce fossil fuels for the immediate short term. In that sense, we think that the policy still stands. Of course, we are open to dialogue to see how exactly it can be implemented. So we are engaging with the various governments surrounding the Arctic geographical zone to compare the notes. But again, as the infrastructure policy we have developed right now, the message is that we are departing from fossil fuels. all our scenarios include the message that we will no longer need natural gas in the same amount as we will up until 2030. And therefore, infrastructure needs to be future-proof. And our future investments need to be orientated towards a world of net zero. So with that in mind, we will certainly be open to discussing further on what this means in practice for Norway and for other countries.
Thank you. There's actually a rather interesting question from the audience. And I'm going to read it out, but I think I might like to add something to it. Is independence from Russian gas really desirable in the long run? Isn't economic interdependence one of the best safeguards against war? And the thing I would like to add is, as you were just pointing out, Joanna, the whole goal is to reach net zero and no fossil fuels, of course, at the end. But economic interdependence could be of other products as well. What do you think of that perspective?
Is the question to me?
Yes, it is, Joanna.
I think in the past weeks we have seen very clearly that the message of economic cooperation with Russia has not quite worked. We have tried the policy of cooperating economically, building on our respective strengths for the past 30 years. And the geopolitics has changed with the Russian invasion on Ukraine, which led us to adopt very bold statements and a conclusion that we absolutely have to depart from the dependence on Russia's fossil fuels, because that has been a source of abuse of position rather than creating positively constructive mutual interdependencies. So we are setting much more on cooperation with like-minded partners, even more than we have done so far, because we had to draw conclusions from what has happened in the past weeks. Of course, the future remains to be seen, and therefore my statement is without prejudice to whatever might happen should the war end at some point.
Thank you very much. We are we are running out of time, but we have a couple of minutes left. And I guess it would be nice to have a final reflection from all of you. Some of you have been talking more than others, and it's also in light of the recent development and so on, which is natural. But if you could say, with a few words, what kind of innovations do we need from this day on and forward at the level of policy and the just transition? Would you like to start, Suzana?
Yeah, I'll go back to my statement that I think that investment in R&D, research and development and deployment is extremely important, because at the end it will be the competition among technologies that will lead to spread a certain technology. Of course, there are several economic mechanisms, but they are tools to promote one or another. But what make the change is the breakthrough on technology. And there are so many things that we, as the gentleman mentioned, that we have even imagined. The amount of possibilities that the ocean gives us, for example, not only to generate energy, waves, tides, temperature gradients, we haven't started yet. Just labs and very pilot projects. So there is a huge potentiality there. But also another potential of capture carbon from the atmosphere. So there are many opportunities out there that if you're not investing in research and how to deploy all these technologies, you won't get into net zero economy. So that's my point. I think it's very, very important to address that. And this is what I mentioned by just transition, because usually the most developed countries, nations and regions, they invest a lot in this just widening. We are widening the gap because they are far ahead of some other nations. There are they're not investing, and at the end they cannot compete. So this is my main point, maybe because I'm from the academia as well. So.
Thank you. So moving from academia to the industry, Peter, you are in charge of making analysis and scenarios. What are you seeing
I've got lots of things on my wish list, but I think the one thing I would leave with policymakers is permitting. It takes too long to build things in Europe, and it doesn't matter whether it's a gas pipeline, a CCS plant, or a power transmission system. We're going to have to build a lot of things, and we're going to have to get a lot faster.
Yeah. So speeding things up. Hege?
So FREYR has 3 strategic tenets. It's speed, scale, and sustainability. And clearly, to our the stakeholders on the policy side, speed is definitely something we need to see more, more innovation in that. And I think it was interesting that Statkraft's CEO was addressing that there has been a change through the pandemic with policymakers, and we can see it now also in the EU when it comes to the energy situation, that there is a sense of urgency and a willingness and an ability to work in speed. I would like to also add, though, that our customers are very demanding on speed and scale. They're all in. The auto industry is absolutely on the tenet on sustainability, but we are incredibly disappointed by the solar industry and the utility sector and the wind industry, because they don't ever ask us for our carbon footprint as a supplier to their industry. So that's really odd, and I would like to see a change.
But you would like to give it to them?
They should only, the solar industry and the wind industry and the utility industry should only buy and have suppliers who have a very, very, very low carbon footprint. We're one of them, and they should be asking for it.
Thank you. I would like to move over to Valerie, and then Joanna can have the final word.
Right, yeah. So if I had to choose one thing, it would be forming international alliances to bring some of the commercial and early stage clean energy technologies to fruition, to demonstrate them and to find early markets. I think that you could see that in the area of fuel cell vehicles, aviation. You could see that in carbon capture and sequestration. You could see that in hydrogen systems. And in order to make that happen, I also see a strong need for regulatory frameworks at multiple levels, nations down to the very local level.
Thank you. Joanna, some final short words from you.
Very briefly, I will challenge myself by saying that policymakers, both at the EU and member states level, have to do their utmost to really help implement the policies. Permitting is one point, spending on R&D, public spending is the other one. We have to speed up.
Thank you very much to all 5 of you, and once again to the front row, and to everyone for participating in this discussion. It's definitely not finished, so we'll have to continue that next time.